Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the glittering golden halls of Versailles, but not in the way your high school textbook promised. You're not here for royal banquets, sunlit gardens, or powdered wigs under chandeliers. No, tonight, you're about to wander through a palace so opulent, so jaw-droppingly magnificent, and yet so absolutely inescapably gross that barnyards might actually smell better. That's not an exaggeration. You'll pass fountains that mask wrought velvet drapes, harboring fleas and parquet floors beneath which lies, well, you'll see. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your city and the local time in the comments. I'm always curious to know where and when you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle slowly down the marble hall, boots softly creaking, your nose already twitching. At first you think it's the musk of perfume, roses, ambergris, maybe cloves, but then the undercurrent hits you. Something animal, something human, something fermented. Welcome to Versailles in its prime, a place where royalty glitters but the air sours. At the peak of its glory, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Versailles stood as the crown jewel of French absolutism, a symbol of divine monarchy. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, transformed this once humble hunting lodge into an endless expanse of halls, mirrors, salons, and private apartments, all gleaming with gold and marble. The idea was to awe, and boy, it did. But what the paintings and portraits don't show you is the smell. You see, Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a living organism, pulsing with thousands of courtiers, servants, soldiers, musicians, and hangers-on. No fewer than 5,000 people lived here full-time, and thousands more drifted through daily. But in all this abundance, one thing was in shockingly short supply: plumbing. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV genuinely intended for Versailles to lack toilets for security reasons, less privacy meant less intrigue, or whether he simply didn't care. Either way, the result was the same. Chamber pots were emptied anywhere, and we mean that literally. Behind tapestries, in hallways, in stairwells, sometimes out of the windows. And the smell didn't just linger, it lived there. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The nobility draped in silks and lace didn't bathe, not often. Bathing, you'll soon learn, was considered dangerous something for peasants or the ill. The royal solution masked the odor. Versailles had entire rooms dedicated to the production of custom perfumes, and the nobles would douse their wigs, gloves, and handkerchiefs in scents strong enough to fell a horse. And it wasn't just personal scent warfare. The palace was frequently sprayed with mixtures of rose water and vinegar, sometimes tossed into the air from ornate jars, just to make corridors breathable. Even then, visitors often reported the place smelling of urine mildew and something that stung the throat. One 19th century visitor, the Duke of Saint-Simon, once complained that the stench in the king's antechamber made his eyes water, and this was normal. Another writer described the perfume of Versailles as a lady's glove soaked in sewage. But of course, no one dared to complain aloud. You pass a gilded corner and nearly slip. Not on water, no. On a soft pile of sawdust, freshly scattered. Why? Because sawdust was used to soak up urine, especially in corners where guests got desperate. Even the famous Hall of Mirrors couldn't escape it. Yes, that glittering corridor filled with sunlight and reflections, it regularly reeked. People relieved themselves behind its massive curtains, or in the alcoves where guards were too bored or too polite to intervene. And it wasn't just the guests. Even the king himself, for all his silk stockings and ermine-trimmed robes, made liberal use of chamber pots during court events. It was considered entirely normal for a nobleman to take a squat behind a drape during a long, diplomatic meeting. Just don't make eye contact. What's worse is that cleaning was rare and inconsistent. While some chambermaids scurried through the rooms with buckets and cloths, others avoided eye contact with messes. One servant recalled stepping around a pile for 3 days before someone finally addressed it. And no, it wasn't her. Here's a fringe detail for your dreams tonight. In some hallways, the smell became so routine that courtiers developed seasonal scent strategies. In winter, heavier amber-based perfumes dominated. In summer, lighter citrus blends because the heat made the stink worse. And in all of this, people were still expected to appear graceful, composed, even flirtatious. You might start to ask yourself, how did no one fix this? Historians still argue whether the royal family truly grasped the level of filth or simply accepted it as normal. For many, Versailles wasn't a place to live, it was a stage. And on a stage, you ignore the lights that burn your eyes and the rot beneath the boards. You just keep acting. And so through halls of painted ceilings and polished marble, you tiptoe, nostrils half-clenched handkerchief at the ready. You are only in section 1. You round another gilded doorway, half expecting a maid with a mop, or at least a disgruntled footman muttering about last night's party. Instead, it's just you and the golden silence of the king's apartment. Well, silence and the faintest sour tang in the air like spoiled milk and warm iron. If Versailles was a palace, it was also a camouflaged latrine. For all its grandeur, plumbing remained stubbornly medieval. Louis XIV did install a few modern latrines, but they were for show, more than sanitation, awkward, clunky things tucked in the corners of noble apartments, flushed with buckets or later crude water systems. But no one used them. Why? They were loud. They were considered undignified. And worst of all, they smelled worse than the chamber pots. The real action happened in secret behind golden doors, under the stairs, or hidden by luxurious velvet drapes. Courtiers used bourdaloes, small oblong chamber pots shaped to fit discreetly between the thighs. Women slipped them under their gowns during long ceremonies. Men simply stepped behind a column, and then they left it there, or handed it to a servant. If the servant was busy, they tucked it behind a bust of Jupiter and kept chatting. You walk into a side salon, sunlight beams through stained windows onto marble floors so clean you could eat off them, if you ignored the stains in the corners. Royal cleaners did their best, bless them, but with thousands of pots to empty, and so many courtiers treating walls like urinals, the task was Sisyphean. Some rooms had official slop buckets placed behind curtains or screens. Others didn't bother. In an era where the phrase go, use the hallway, was a real suggestion, etiquette collided spectacularly with biology. Now imagine what all of this meant for the servants. One footman recalled in his memoirs how he once tripped over a forgotten chamber pot in the king's audience room during an actual diplomatic meeting. He fell, the pot tipped, and well, you get the idea. The ambassador was not amused. And that's the strangest part. The people living here normalized it. Smell was status neutral. Even the queen wasn't spared. Marie Antoinette's private rooms were notoriously aromatic, perfume to the ceiling, yes, but also laced with body odor damp upholstery and sometimes mice, royal mice, possibly more hygienic than the guests. A quirky little detail. The palace's vast collection of tapestries and wall hangings served more than decorative purposes. There were insulation, soundproofing, and yes, scent blockers. Heavy fabrics trapped heat. And also the worst stenches. That's right. The more ornate the room, the more likely it was a hotbox of fermented humanity. You pause near a statue perhaps of Apollo or Diana. Beneath it, a faded rug covers a curious bulge. Don't lift it. You don't want to know. One traveler described a small antechamber off the Hall of Mirrors as a place where the air died. He claimed a dead bird lay in the corner for 3 days completely undisturbed. It wasn't that no one saw it, it was that no one noticed it smelled any worse than usual. Historians still argue whether the palace's cleaning staff was criminally understaffed or simply overwhelmed by the scale of court life. There were technically crews assigned to sweep, scrub, and haul waste, but they weren't always trained. Many were part-time laborers, pulled from nearby towns, paid in food and shelter, and sometimes the sheer volume of waste outpaced them. You imagine being one of them. Dressed in linen rags, bucket in hand, tiptoeing into a royal bedchamber, and finding 8 used chamber pots, one of which is leaking, another cracked, and none of them labeled. You'd hope for a good tip. You'd get a slap or a grunt, and yet amid the sensory chaos, Versailles still glittered. The mirrors were polished. The chandeliers sparkled. Visitors gasped. Musicians played. Dancers twirled. All while the corner behind the harpsichord concealed 2 full piss pots and a crumpled napkin used for something. But the crown jewel of this absurdity, the famous toilet chairs, yes, thrones in the most literal sense. Some were cushioned, some had ornate carvings, some even had warming trays beneath them. The king had one. So did several dukes, but again these were used as props as often as practical devices. Sometimes they were more status symbols than seats. You weren't truly powerful until you could relieve yourself and still get a round of applause. So as you step out of this otherwise breathtaking salon, you feel both enchanted and mildly nauseated. That's Versailles for you, a cathedral of contrasts. The scent of decay beneath chandeliers, golden cornices masking mildew, opulence at war with overflow. And you haven't even reached the gardens yet. You slip out through a side door, blinking into the morning light, only to be struck by a wave of warm air, not fresh, not quite floral, and definitely not what you'd expect from the gardens of the most majestic palace in Europe. You take a deep breath and nearly regret it. Because this isn't just a garden, it's a battlefield between design and decomposition. Versailles' gardens were legendary. Designed by André Le Nôtre, they were masterpieces of symmetry and grandeur, stretching over 800 hectares with meticulously trimmed hedges, reflective pools, fountains that seemed to defy gravity, and endless paths designed to showcase both nature and control over it. But the illusion depended on you not looking too closely or sniffing too hard. You wander past a row of orange trees in decorative planters. They're lovely, but something earthy creeps beneath the citrus. That's because these gardens, for all their beauty, had a secret fertilizer, and it wasn't just manure. It was you. Well, people like you. Servants, soldiers, visitors, nobles. They all had one thing in common. No good place to go. The palace's lack of proper toilets didn't end indoors. The outdoors became essentially a communal bathroom. Hedges, alcoves, marble fountains. Everything was fair game. Some parts of the garden were so frequently used that gardeners had to rotate sections like crops, letting oversaturated patches of soil recover. There were even reports of signs being posted, "Do not relieve yourself here. Use the East Grove. Imagine a royal decree directing bowel traffic." Historians still argue whether these practices were tolerated due to necessity or laziness, but there's no debate about the effects. The so-called fragrance of Versailles extended far beyond the walls. One diplomat in 1748 noted that the rose beds smelled faintly of rot and damp linen. And yes, while manure was common in most pre-modern gardening, Versailles went the extra mile. Raw human waste straight from chamber pots was routinely added to garden soil. No composting, no waiting period, just scoop dump and rake it in. Why efficiency? The palace generated enormous amounts of waste and had limited disposal options. Nearby fields couldn't handle the volume, so the gardens became a solution, or a sacrifice. Picture this. You're a court lady strolling through the royal maze, trailing silk. Behind you swaying a scented fan. The scent of roses mingles with yesterday's dinner now redistributed among the hydrangeas. One gardener's diary survives with a glorious little tidbit. He describes having to hose down statues, not from rain or mud, but from persistent stains left by certain members of the court who used the marble figures as targets during midnight wanderings, his tone utterly resigned. Even the fountains, those marvels of hydraulics, weren't safe. The Grand Canal, a huge artificial waterway where nobles rowed ornate boats, often collected runoff from nearby soil. During hot summers, it reportedly smelled like a soup left too long in the sun. And yet these very gardens were celebrated across Europe. Visitors called them divine eternal and heaven brought to earth. It seems that much like modern Instagram filters, reality was politely ignored. You didn't comment on the smell, you commented on the symmetry. A quirky little aside, Versailles gardeners often used masks soaked in vinegar while tending flower beds in peak heat. Not for style. For survival, some even stuffed herbs into their nostrils, a practice shared with executioners, oddly enough. And remember, those orange trees, imported from warmer climates, they were kept in massive planters and rolled into orangeries in winter. But in summer, they were piss magnets. Their fragrant blossoms couldn't hide what courtiers did behind them. Legend says that Louis XV once passed an orange tree and joked that it smelled of politics. So you continue walking, perhaps slower, now squinting between hedgerows, not just admiring the artistry, but searching for signs of former disgrace. You begin to notice the discolorations on marble, the unusual tilts in benches, the earth that's a little too soft beneath the roses. Versailles was a theater, and the gardens were the stage set. But behind the stage were actors peeing behind curtains. And here you are, centuries later, tracing their paths. You leave the garden behind, a little warier of every ornate bush, and re-enter the palace through one of its lesser-used galleries. The air inside is cooler, but the stench still clings to the velvet-lined walls like a memory. And now you find yourself wondering if the outdoors were that bad. Why didn't they just bathe more? Now we get to one of Versailles' most bewildering truths: bathing was feared. You glance into a chamber decorated with painted cherubs and swan motifs. There's a porcelain basin in the corner. Surely that's where someone took a bath, right? Well, not quite. That was for washing hands, maybe a face if you were feeling reckless. Full body immersion, dangerous, unhealthy, radical. Most people at Versailles, including the royals, believed that water opened the pores, and through those pores, disease could enter. Medical science at the time endorsed it. The theory went that your skin protected you like armor, and scrubbing it too much was like poking holes in your only shield. You'd be inviting sickness, or madness, or both. So instead of bathing, people changed their linens. Underwear, shirts, chemises. Linen was considered cleansing in itself, absorbing sweat oils, and yes, other bodily emissions. The upper classes often changed multiple times a day, which they considered sufficient hygiene. Historians still argue whether this method was actually effective or just a socially palatable excuse to avoid the cold shock of actual water. But one thing is clear: being clean at Versailles had very little to do with water and everything to do with layers. One quirky detail: Louis XIV is said to have taken only a handful of full-body baths in his entire life, and he was proud of it. On one occasion, he reportedly soaked in water as a medical treatment, then bragged to courtiers about how unnatural the whole experience felt. Others gasped in sympathy. You pass a gilded mirror, its surface slightly foggy with age, and imagine the court ladies standing before it. Skin-powdered white cheeks, blushed with crushed beetle teeth, possibly darkened from lead in their cosmetics. But all of it topped off with a head held high, because appearances were everything, and they masked a lot. To counteract odors, nobles deployed what one servant called a perfume arsenal. Gloves were lined with scented wax. Wigs were dusted with lavender. Even canes and snuff boxes had hidden compartments filled with potpourri. You were never more than a flick of the wrist away from a survival scent. Perfume wasn't just fashion, it was armor. Now imagine a crowded ballroom in July. The Hall of Mirrors is packed shoulder to shoulder with breathing, sweating, heavily dressed bodies. No ventilation, no deodorant, and certainly no shower to freshen up beforehand. The chandeliers shimmer in the candlelight while your nostrils scream. One visiting diplomat from Sweden described the royal ball as a perfume shop caught fire in a tannery, and he was being polite. Even the Queen's attendants weren't spared. Marie Antoinette was known for her extravagant scent preferences. One of her favorites, orange blossom layered over musk. Her bedroom was reportedly kept perfumed at all hours. But one chambermaid wrote in a secret letter that the sweetness of the room turned thick by night, like a cake left too long in the sun. And remember, beneath those layers of perfume were unwashed bodies. Wounds, rashes, rotting teeth, a smallpox scar here, a festering sore there. Nobles carried tiny fans, not just for flirtation, but to wave away the reek. Still, public bathing did exist just far away from Versailles. In cities like Paris, bathhouses lingered, but they were often associated with immorality or illness. A woman entering one might be mistaken for a courtesan, a man suspect, or worse, suspiciously clean. But here among the opulence of Versailles, filth was cloaked in lace. And you realize something: people didn't just ignore the smell. They rewrote it. They convinced themselves it wasn't there, or if it was part of the nobility. Like powdered wigs and unread books, stink was a symbol of rank. You glance again at that porcelain basin, cold, shiny, empty. No one's going to fill it tonight. You drift down a narrow corridor, your footsteps muffled by threadbare carpet, and suddenly find yourself standing before a gilded door. A footman might have once stood here announcing guests with exaggerated flair, but this wasn't the entrance to a ballroom or a bedroom. This was the antechamber to one of Versailles' most bewildering rituals, the royal morning routine, because here the king didn't just wake up, he performed it. Welcome to the levee, where nobles lined up for the sacred privilege of watching the king open his eyes, stretch, and yes, go to the bathroom. You push the door open in your imagination and step into a world of choreographed chaos. The king lies in a velvet-draped bed. Around him, a rotating cast of attendants, physicians, nobles, valets, and depending on the time, diplomats or random aristocrats hoping to gain favor. There were rules, many. Only certain nobles could hold the king's shirt. Others were allowed to present his slippers, and the ultimate honor assisting with his morning needs. The royal chamber pot, made of silver of course, was kept discreetly nearby. Or not so discreetly. During the levee, it was entirely possible to be standing 5 feet from the monarch as he relieved himself into it. And no, the curtains weren't always drawn. Historians still argue whether this spectacle was meant to humble the king or glorify him. Was it vulnerability as divine privilege? Or just a case of courtly creepiness taken to its logical extreme? Either way, the message was clear: proximity to bodily functions meant proximity to power. One fringe fact: there are surviving records of courtiers actually fighting over the right to hand the king his towel after his ceremonial hand wash. Because to do so meant recognition, influence, even promotion. You slowly move past the imagined king, seated regally on his throne. Only this time it's a toilet throne, known as the chaise percée or pierced chair. It was built like any other luxurious seat, except for the obvious modification. Cushioned, upholstered, and discreetly placed in corners of various rooms, a symbol of elegance and also digestion. And the king wasn't alone. Dukes, counts, even bishops had similar chairs in their private apartments. Bathroom visits weren't private in the way we understand them now. If you were important, someone was probably watching or at least nearby. In fact, many nobles kept up casual conversations while using their chamber pots. A respected marquis might discuss taxation policy midstream. A duchess might excuse herself only by turning her back. Doors optional. Of course, servants bore the brunt of this openness. You glance at a wall panel, harmless, you think until you remember what often lay behind these panels. Storage closets. Sometimes. Other times, a makeshift relief station. Chamber pots lined up neatly, or not so neatly. And who emptied them? Young footmen, housemaids, chamber attendants too lowly to speak but essential enough to handle the worst tasks. One such servant in a surviving letter described how he'd become nose-blind within a week. He said he could identify nobles by the smell of their morning pots. Whether that's true or just dark humor is unclear. Either way, he probably wasn't exaggerating. You keep walking and imagine being one of those nobles. Perhaps a viscount. You've spent hours perfecting your wig, adjusting your lace cuffs, and applying rouge to your cheeks, and yet none of it matters if you miss the levee. If you don't show up and bow, at the precise moment the king's feet touch the floor, your entire week might be ruined. Your access revoked, your influence lost. So you arrive early, you wait, you bow, and if you're lucky, you get to watch the monarch scratch yawn and yes pay. There was even a schedule for who could be present during different stages of the levee. The Grand Chamberlain, had access from the first stirrings. By the time the king was fully dressed, the room was often full of low-ranking courtiers, hoping to catch his eye without catching a whiff. A quirky rumor circulated among the pages that the king once passed wind during the levee, and 3 different dukes claimed credit for causing it, hoping it would mean they were remembered fondly. You smile. You wince. And you realize that Versailles was a machine, one fueled by hierarchy ritual and utter disregard for privacy. And so each morning, amid the perfume and the powdered wigs, the King of France began his day like any other man, just with 50 people watching a gold-plated pot beneath him and history recording every bowel movement like gospel. You step into a long corridor lined with portraits, dukes, duchesses, marquises, all staring down at you with powdered faces and elaborate hairstyles. They look dignified, refined. But now, after everything you've seen and smelled, you can't help but wonder how many of these carefully dressed nobles were crawling with lice. Because that too was Versailles. Underneath the wigs, behind the rouge, and beneath those thick layers of silk and satin, the court of Versailles itched, quite literally. Let's talk fashion and filth. The gowns were elaborate, the wigs were architectural. Men wore breeches, stockings, waistcoats, and layers of lace that could make a small dog disappear. Women cinched themselves into bodices so tight they sometimes fainted. It was theatre, all of it. Grand, glorious, expensive, and deeply unhygienic. Under all that glamour, nobles rarely wore undergarments as we know them today. Washable underwear wasn't exactly a staple. And without regular bathing, the body simply did what bodies do: sweat shed, skin produce oils. Combined with those thick, non-breathable fabrics and tight corsets, it created the perfect breeding ground for lice rashes and even fungi. Historians still argue whether nobles truly understood the consequences of their clothing or simply endured them in the name of status. But either way, one thing is clear: the richer you were, the more layers of stink you carried. Take wigs, for instance. Wigs weren't just fashionable, they were essential. Hair was shaved off or cut short, and powdered wigs were worn daily. These wigs were sometimes made of horsehair or human hair, stiffened with wax and powder. And they were rarely cleaned. Why? Because cleaning them meant disassembling them, and that risked losing their carefully sculpted shape. So what happened instead? They became homes for lice. The solution: sprinkle your scalp with powder, often made of flour or starch, and hope for the best. Some people added mercury or arsenic compounds to the powder, believing it killed vermin. It also slowly poisoned them, but beauty has its price. A quirky little side note: many wigs were scented, not just with lavender or citrus, but with musk, an animal-based scent meant to cover everything from sweat to, yes, rotting scalp sores. And no one blinked. You were elegant, dignified, smelling like a decaying deer, a small price to pay. And the gowns, oh, the gowns. Women often wore the same elaborate dress all day, and sometimes several days in a row. Changing outfits was a luxury, and laundering them a nightmare. Instead of washing, servants would spot clean the visible parts, repin trimmings, and perfume the layers. The underside ignored. One maid recounted how she once lifted the train of a duchess's dress and discovered mold growing on the hem, thick and grey, from repeated trampling through damp corridors. The duchess reportedly laughed and said it added character. But it wasn't just the outfits, it was how long they were worn. Court events stretched for hours, even days. People stood packed together in stuffy salons, perspiring beneath chandeliers. Everyone was breathing the same thick, perfumed, humid air. Sweat rolled down spines, makeup smeared, wigs wilted, and no one left to change because leaving meant losing visibility. Versailles operated on visibility. You had to be seen, admired, envied, even if that meant enduring the slow roast of your own flesh in a 12-layer outfit. Remember the idea of social hygiene. In this world, cleanliness wasn't a matter of soap and water. It was performance. If you looked composed, you were clean. If you smelled like lavender and civet, you were fashionable. If your face was white with powder, even if the skin beneath it festered, you were noble. And servants weren't spared either. While they wore simpler clothes, they still had to work in the same oppressive heat and odor. But unlike nobles, they couldn't retreat behind perfume. They simply learned to tolerate the stench. Or they didn't, and collapsed in corridors as one footman reportedly did after inhaling too much wig powder and too little air. A final oddity for you, there was a brief trend at Versailles for perfumed mice, tiny rodents kept as pets by some noblewomen, lightly scented and tucked into sleeves or bodices. The idea was that they'd help refresh the air. The reality, well, the mice sometimes escaped or died. The trend mercifully did not last long. So as you walk through the Hall of Portraits, take a moment. Look into those painted eyes and know that beneath every powdered face was a body waging a quiet war against odor vermin and slowly rotting silk. And they smiled for the artist anyway. You turn a corner, hoping for a whiff of something less offensive, and instead find yourself in a long columned hallway with decorative vases perched on marble pedestals. They're beautiful, sure, but you now know better than to assume anything decorative at Versailles was strictly decorative. Because in this world of sensory warfare, even the vases had a job, and it wasn't always floral. Some of these vases, you realize with quiet horror, were once used to hold scented waters, vinegar-soaked cloths, or dried herbs meant to cut through the ever-present miasma of rot and sweat. Others held perfumed wax. Some, when desperation struck, even served as emergency chamber pots. You step cautiously, and you start to think about the strange science, if you can call it that, of Versailles' scent culture. This wasn't just about luxury, this was survival. In the absence of water-based hygiene, Versailles relied on olfactory layering. A person's scent wasn't just a pleasant detail, it was an identity, a weapon, even a way to assert social standing. You pass by a side table where a porcelain bottle might once have sat, perhaps filled with something sweet, maybe rosewater, or something intense like ambergris, a substance regurgitated by sperm whales, prized for its musky, earthy aroma. It was the Chanel No. 5 of the 18th century. Historians still debate whether the obsession with scent at Versailles stemmed from genuine affection or desperate olfactory warfare. But one thing's certain, if you didn't smell like money, you didn't belong. Even the floors weren't safe. Throughout the palace, stewards would scatter herbs and flowers, lavender thyme mint across the parquet. Crushed underfoot, they'd release their scent into the air. It was meant to distract from the urine. It worked, sort of. Let's not forget the iconic pomander, a small, often ornate ball, filled with aromatic substances that people carried or wore. Some were held on chains like a pocket watch, others tucked into waistbands or sewn into gloves. You walking through Versailles would have likely carried one just to stay conscious during summer receptions. And perfume wasn't just for women. Oh no. Men at Versailles were just as drenched in scent, if not more so. Musk, sandalwood, bergamot tobacco. The variety was staggering, and sometimes conflicting. It wasn't uncommon to smell 4 different colognes in one breath. And still underneath it all, human funk prevailed. There's even evidence that some nobles had perfume walls, panels, soaked in fragrance designed to radiate scent into rooms. Imagine walking into someone's sitting room and being immediately hit with an aromatic ambush of citrus, jasmine, and mildew. Your eyes water. You smile politely. You keep breathing. The palace even had a resident perfumer, a position of great honor. They were responsible not only for crafting individual scents for royalty, but for creating entire aromatic environments. Some rooms had signature scents: the queen's bedroom, rose and violet; the king's study, leather and spice. And yet, nothing could mask the palace entirely. A particularly quirky record from 1774 describes an incident where a visiting noblewoman fainted during a royal banquet, not from emotion, but from the overlap of too many perfumes and too little oxygen. She was revived with vinegar and removed through a side exit. The scent her maid noted later remained in her dress for weeks. But here's the thing, Versailles didn't see this as a problem. Smell wasn't private, it was political. Your scent was a message, a status symbol, a declaration that you belonged among the powdered elite. And woe unto those who didn't. Foreign ambassadors, unaware of these olfactory rules, often arrived unprepared. One Austrian emissary, upon entering the Hall of Mirrors, was handed a perfumed glove and told quite seriously to breathe through it if necessary. He thought it a joke. It was not. Another visitor from Poland described Versailles as a perfumed corpse. Beautiful, lifeless, and exuding something between incense and illness. You walk past another door, this one slightly ajar. Inside you imagine a young courtier seated beside a window, dabbing perfume onto his wig tips while humming softly. Outside horses clatter, inside flowers rot in their vases. Everything smells like someone trying very hard not to smell like themselves. And just when you think you've adjusted, a gust of wind stirs the heavy curtains, releasing a puff of scent from the wall hangings, lavender turned moldy roses fermented in their own dust. The palace breathes, and you breathe with it cautiously. You descend a shallow staircase into a darker corridor, the marble giving way to stone tiles worn smooth by centuries of feet, royal, noble, and otherwise. It's cooler here, quieter, but somehow the smell clings more desperately, like it's been trapped for centuries and is just now meeting fresh lungs. You've entered the underbelly of Versailles. Not metaphorically, literally, because Versailles wasn't just gold and mirrors. It was also a cramped, chaotic city, squeezed inside a palace, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the servant quarters, storage halls, and overflow spaces where people lived in, well, let's call it dense humanity. The palace wasn't built to house 5,000 people, but that's what it ended up doing. Servants, soldiers, clerks, musicians, scribes, visiting nobles, and even their pets. These weren't well-appointed bedrooms with tapestries and writing desks. They were makeshift cubbies jammed into attics, basements, closets, and in some cases literal alcoves under staircases. And they weren't just sleeping there, they were living there. One surviving map of Versailles' interior quarters shows hundreds of tiny rooms, many no larger than a pantry, stacked atop one another like nesting boxes. Privacy was a joke, ventilation worse, and sanitation almost non-existent. Most of these inhabitants didn't have access to chamber pots, let alone proper facilities. So where did they go? Sometimes in the hallway, sometimes out a window, sometimes if they were lucky into a shared slop bucket that might not be emptied for days. You imagine trying to sleep in such a space, wrapped in a thin blanket, your roommate snoring 6 inches away, the walls sweating with condensation, and a low constant smell of waste and unwashed bodies thick in the air. Add in rats, add in fleas, welcome to the real Versailles. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV truly understood how bad the conditions had become, or whether he preferred not to. Some accounts suggest he was told the palace smelled of loyalty and labor, which is poetic and disgusting. A quirky fringe detail, some servants secretly created scent rituals of their own, burning citrus peels, soaking bread in vinegar, or crushing mint leaves in handkerchiefs. Others hung dried herbs over their bunks, or even pinned garlic to their clothes, not to ward off vampires, but the stench of each other. And yet despite the misery competition for a spot inside Versailles was fierce. Why? Because proximity to the court, even if you were sleeping in a glorified broom closet, meant opportunity. A chance to be noticed, to rise, to escape your station, even if you smelled like boiled socks doing it. You make your way down a corridor that once served as both kitchen overflow and servant dormitory. The walls are stained, the air is thick. You notice scorch marks on the ceiling, maybe from candles, maybe from cook fires, or maybe just from being overused and undercleaned for decades. The closer you get to the service heart of the palace, the worse it gets. Because this wasn't a clean separation between upstairs and downstairs. It was a muddle. Lavish suites shared walls with storage rooms. One noble might sleep in silk, while 2 servants squatted behind a tapestry 6 feet away, whispering in the dark. It's easy to forget that Versailles wasn't one pristine structure. It was alive, constantly being remodeled, expanded, patched, and crammed, full of people, There were over 700 rooms and no modern plumbing. None. Waste had to go somewhere, and often that somewhere was nowhere. Visitors frequently commented on the palace's peculiar odors, especially in side wings and unused galleries. One English guest noted that while Versailles sparkled at first glance, a longer stay revealed certain corners where the air behaved most impolitely. And what about the walls? Oh, the walls. Behind the plaster and wood paneling lurked hidden passageways, servant tunnels, and old unused latrines that no one had gotten around to sealing. Sometimes the smell would creep through cracks like a ghost. Other times the wall itself would weep moisture from something best not investigated. You stop beside a storage room. Inside are dusty crates, broken furniture, and something that may or may not have once been a mop. This was someone's home. Someone's whole life at court. Close enough to hear the king snore. Close enough to smell the queen's perfume. But not close enough to have a toilet. And yet they stayed, because at Versailles, being uncomfortable, even miserable, was often better than being unseen. You breathe shallowly as you walk back toward the light, trying not to dwell on what's soaking into your shoes. The glamour of Versailles has begun to feel like a mirage, something painted on a thin wall hiding a rot that no perfume could truly mask. You step back into the main halls, now blinking as the light of chandeliers scatters across the polished parquet floors. Your eyes adjust, but your nose, poor thing, has long since surrendered. You've smelled everything from rotting silks to fermented wig powder, but nothing quite prepares you for what you're about to confront Versailles' approach to toilets, or rather its lack thereof. You might think a palace with over 700 rooms and thousands of daily occupants would prioritize sanitation. And yet Versailles, Grand Brilliant Versailles, had only a handful of actual latrines, most of which were rarely used and poorly maintained. The prevailing attitude toilets were for peasants. You find yourself near one of the few official toilets tucked discreetly near a servant's corridor. It's essentially a wooden bench with a hole suspended over a shaft that theoretically connected to a cesspit. The problem, the shaft often didn't go anywhere. Or it did, and it backed up. The engineering was rudimentary, at best non-existent at worst. The result, a toilet that reeks constantly, leaks regularly, and is feared by everyone who knows better. Nobles avoided them completely. Chamber pots were the true rulers of Versailles, and not the sleek, discreet kind. We're talking heavy porcelain basins, metal pails, and in some cases literal buckets, with nothing more than a linen cloth for privacy. These pots were stashed behind curtains, tucked beneath beds, or left in the open, depending on urgency. One contemporary observer claimed it was not uncommon to find a chamber pot nestled beside a harpsichord or tucked beneath a throne. Romantic, isn't it? But what happened after the pot was used? That's where things got really interesting, because there was no formal disposal system. Some were emptied into cesspits in the garden, some into the courtyard drains, and many simply dumped out the window. Yes, out the window. There are verified reports of courtiers flinging waste from upper floors onto the grounds below. The etiquette, believe it or not, was to shout a warning, garde à l'eau, before tossing the contents. If you were lucky, you heard it in time. If not, you were initiated into Versailles the hard way. Historians still argue whether this behavior was tolerated because of necessity or arrogance. But it happened so often that some guests refused to walk through certain courtyards without a hat and a servant holding an umbrella. One wonderfully bizarre detail. Some nobles had gold-trimmed chamber pots, not just as a joke but as a genuine reflection of status. A viscount's pot might have porcelain roses. A duke's might be monogrammed. The king's rumor says it bore the royal crest and was emptied by a designated footman with a velvet sash. And yes, that was considered a position of honor. You glance around the hall. Its beautiful white, marble busts, delicate wall panels, sunlight streaming through arched windows. But then your gaze falls on the dark stains near the baseboards. Water, maybe? Or something else. A page boy once tripped while carrying a full chamber pot and spilled the contents across this very floor according to a record from 1721. They tried to clean it. They did their best. but the marble absorbed some of it, and the smell lingered for weeks. There was also a small private corridor once dubbed the couloir puant, the stinking hallway. It earned this title because chamber pots were routinely left there for collection, except no one ever came to collect them. They just sat and waited and fermented. One servant swore he saw mold growing on the air. But it wasn't just humans contributing to this chaos. Versailles was full of animals, lapdogs, hunting hounds, parrots, monkeys. Pets were fashion statements, accessories, even political tools. And they all needed to go somewhere. Often they went wherever they wanted. Carpets, pillows, even beds. Marie Antoinette reportedly had a pug who was known for relieving himself on visiting dignitaries' shoes, and rather than being horrified, she laughed. Court etiquette dictated that the guest smile through it. To scold a royal dog was a bigger offense than being urinated on by one. A final image for you: one hallway at Versailles had to be entirely repaneled after years of accumulated waste soaked into the wood. They covered it with fresh wallpaper, scented it with rosemary, and carried on. Problem solved, at least visually. So as you pause in this grand gleaming corridor, remember that beneath your feet lies a history, not just of diplomacy and dancing, but of urine stains, forgotten pots, and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that even kings must poop. You're not just touring a palace, you're walking through the world's most gilded, perfumed, and unapologetically filthy toilet maze. You follow the scent of baked bread and simmering broth down a winding back corridor, your stomach cautiously intrigued. Maybe, just maybe, you've finally found a corner of Versailles that doesn't reek of old wigs and forgotten chamber pots. But as you step into the palace kitchens, that hope dies faster than a soufflé in a thunderstorm. Because while Versailles' meals were legendary tables, piled high with roast, pheasant, truffles, and sculpted pastries, the kitchens themselves were a hellish blend of heat, noise, and rot. And rats. So many rats. The royal kitchens were massive, housed in multiple buildings and annexes surrounding the main palace. They served hundreds of mouths daily, not just the king and queen, but also courtiers, guests, guards, servants, and more. The logistics were mind-boggling, and the sanitation barely a rumor. You enter the cavernous space and immediately feel the temperature rise. Multiple hearths blaze with fire. Cooks shout in overlapping voices. Scullery maids scurry past with dripping trays. Someone somewhere is butchering something and you'd rather not know what. And then the smell hits you. It's meat, but not fresh. Fish, but not clean. Onions. Smoke. And beneath it all something sweet and rotting like fruit left too long in a sunbeam. A noble might dine on a pheasant stuffed with lark and chestnut, but you can bet that same bird sat unrefrigerated for far too long before reaching the spit. Historians still argue whether the palace kitchens had any real concept of food safety, or if they simply cooked fast enough to outrun the stench. Spoiled meat? Cover it in spices. Bad vegetables, boil them until unrecognizable. If it looks edible, serve it. If it smells weird, perfume the plate. One fringe detail: cooks often smoked inside the kitchens, not just for pleasure, but because it masked the smell of rot. You know a kitchen's in trouble when pipe smoke is the most pleasant aroma. And the rats, oh, they thrived. Scurrying between sacks of flour, gnawing through cured meats, nesting in the insulation. Servants waged nightly battles with them. One kitchen boy reportedly trapped 14 rats in a single week. He received a slice of cake as a reward. He earned it. There were no refrigerators, of course, and no ice. Cooling was done with cellars and faith. In the summer, entire barrels of butter turned rancid. Milk fermented in hours. And while salt and smoke helped preserve some goods, many items were simply served quickly and quietly before anyone noticed. You pass a row of pots so blackened with soot they might as well be cannonballs. The walls are streaked with grease. The ceiling is coated in a layer of grime so thick it flakes like pastry. This somehow is where the magic happened. Yet despite the filth, Versailles' menus were extravagant. Banquets included dozens of dishes, percours, terrines, pâtés, stews, confections, and absurd creations like roasted swans reassembled to look alive. They served art on plates, slightly spoiled art, but art nonetheless. A quirky tidbit. Some foods were chosen not for taste but for their sound. Chefs selected crusty breads or crisp fried items to create pleasing noises in the echoing halls. Versailles wasn't just a feast, it was a performance. Even if the food tasted like slightly burned socks, it sounded delicious. You stop near a wooden door, half hanging on its hinges. It leads to the garbage pit, or what passed for one. Here's where bones, vegetable peelings, and spoiled leftovers were dumped. The smell is unspeakable. You hold your breath as you peer inside just long enough to see a scuttling tail disappear into the gloom. Waste from the kitchens wasn't removed regularly. It often piled up for days and sometimes weeks, especially during festivals. The rats weren't just visitors, they were tenants. Still, nobles never saw this. They received gilded platters, folded napkins, sculpted jellies. Their biggest concern was whether the chef had used enough truffle oil, and when they were done eating, the leftovers often went to favored servants. The rest was discarded or quietly resold on the black market. One kitchen ledger lists entire roasts mysteriously missing. Everyone knew where they went. No one said a word. Even the queen wasn't spared. Marie Antoinette, famously picky, once refused to eat a meal because the dish cover was tarnished. Meanwhile, the roast beneath it was already green around the edges. So here you stand at the greasy heart of the palace. It's hot. It's loud. It's crawling. And it's feeding an empire of powdered nobles who'll never know their pudding shared a room with a rat. You take one last look around before backing slowly out. You've had enough for one night. You step out of the kitchens into a quieter corridor, the air cooler, but carrying something deeply baked in, a sort of historic mildew, like steam that's turned into memory. You imagine for a moment that you've escaped the worst of Versailles' sensory warfare, but then you meet her, a chambermaid, young, pale from candlelight and powdered wig dust. Her hands are raw, her eyes dart with a look that says she hasn't slept through a full night in months. Because beneath the wigs and jewels, beneath the perfumes and chamber pots, Versailles ran on one thing: servants, and they lived a very different kind of life. You might expect the servants to move silently and invisibly, like ghosts behind the grandeur, and they did. But they also lived with the worst of the filth, the heaviest of the work, and the least of the thanks. Historians still argue whether the servant class at Versailles was a privileged elite for being close to power, or a trapped underclass living in misery. The answer is both. You could be one curtain away from the king's pillow, and also sleeping beside a bucket of spoiled meat and 3 chamber pots. Many of these workers were children or teens, boys who lit thousands of candles, girls who emptied 30 chamber pots before breakfast, all for pennies, and the privilege of being slapped by a minor noble if they folded the sheets wrong. You pause in a dim hall where portraits don't hang. This isn't the part of the palace anyone painted. You notice faint scratches on the stone, a servant's name maybe, a quiet rebellion carved in a moment of exhaustion. A quirky account tells of a maid who wore clothespins on her nose just to empty the queen's slop bucket. Her fellow workers laughed until she passed out from holding her breath too long. These maids and valets developed rituals of survival. Pinched herbs in the pockets, ragged cloths soaked in lavender tied under the chin. They whispered tricks to each other, how to carry waste without spilling, how to breathe shallowly without fainting, how to recognize a rat's nest from the smell alone. And if you were a bedchamber servant, your day began and ended with bodily fluids. You changed sheets, soiled in sweat, and worse. You shaved noble armpits, powdered sores, wiped spittle from velvet chairs, and cleaned vomit hidden under banquet tables, often all before lunch. It was said that a good servant never flinches. But how do you not flinch when asked to hold the royal chamber pot as someone relieves themselves while discussing tax reform? One fringe detail from a valet's diary he once had to chase a chicken out of the king's bedchamber. It had escaped from the kitchens and nested under the bed. The king was not amused, neither was the valet who had to mop up after the bird's visit. Then there were the mid-level servants, the ones in charge of discreet removals. They weren't allowed to speak of what they saw. One man carried out so many bloodied rags during one queen's illness that he began to suffer fainting spells from the smell alone. He was dismissed not for failing but for weakness of spirit. And yet through it all the palace kept functioning, kept shimmering, because these exhausted, overworked souls made it shimmer. You pass a low door barely 5 feet tall. This was once a servant's entrance to a noble's chamber, so low they had to bow to enter, a literal architectural reminder of their place in the world. You imagine crawling through it, arms full of linens, while trying not to gag on whatever surprise awaited inside. There were moments of dark humor. A popular game among young pages was to place flowers in chamber pots left in public halls. Sometimes nobles mistook them for decorative urns and complimented them. Everyone would pretend not to laugh. But there were also moments of quiet tragedy. Servants fell ill. They died of fevers, of lung infections, of overwork. They were replaced quickly. No plaques, no mention in court diaries, just a shrug, a nod, and a new set of tired hands. You pause now, letting the silence of the hall wrap around you. You realize that beneath every polished floor was someone on their knees scrubbing. Behind every silk curtain was someone holding their breath. And for every noble lounging in a perfumed chair, there was a servant behind it carrying a bucket, holding back a cough. They were the ones who made the filth disappear, even though it never really did. You breathe in. It still smells faintly of vinegar-soaked cloth. Someone cleaned here. Someone is always cleaning. You follow the corridor until it opens into a small reception room with faded gold trim and a crooked tapestry depicting some kind of hunting scene deer, probably, though it's hard to tell with the stain creeping up one corner. This room was once for guests. Not the inner circle, of course, but foreign dignitaries, ambitious nobles, and occasional minor royals. People who came to see the glory of Versailles and often left with a very different kind of memory. Because if there's one thing Versailles was famous for, aside from powdered wigs and dysfunctional plumbing, it was impressing visitors. Or trying to. You sit in one of the hardback chairs, imagining what it must have been like to enter the space, fresh off a carriage ride, hopeful, wide-eyed, and about to be hit by the aromatic equivalent of a punch in the face. Foreigners didn't know the rules. They didn't arrive with vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs. They hadn't trained their noses for Versailles. So their letters home are priceless. A Swedish baron visiting in the 1760s wrote that Versailles sparkled like the crown of God, but smelt like a stable in the summer. He described sweating through his silk coat during a formal greeting, watching flies crawl across a windowsill, and wondering whether to breathe or just pass out politely. Historians still argue whether the French court understood how bad it seemed to outsiders or simply didn't care. After all, they were the center of the world. Who were these Austrians or Spaniards to criticize? A quirky little gem. One British envoy attempted to flatter the king by praising the aromatic vibrancy of the palace. The king raised an eyebrow and replied, "Ah, yes, the perfumes of loyalty." No one laughed. Everyone sniffed. Politely, another visitor, a Polish noblewoman, wrote that she nearly fainted in the queen's antechamber because the rose water did battle with something I dare not name. She added helpfully that it reminded her of her uncle's cheese cellar, not the good kind. And yet Versailles dazzled. The architecture, the pageantry, the music, it was overwhelming. Some guests were so stunned by the sheer visual grandeur that they convinced themselves the smell was simply a French custom. A few even tried to mimic it back home. One Russian countess reportedly imported tapestries soaked in ambergris to recreate the Versailles fragrance. Her guests fled within minutes. You walk slowly past the tapestry, wondering how many of these visitors made it to dinner. Because the court loved to host lavish banquets, formal receptions, masked balls, all steeped in tradition and dense air. Imagine attending a diplomatic reception in the Hall of Mirrors. Light pours in through towering windows, dancing across golden moldings. Harpsichord music plays. But there's a smear on the marble. Someone's dog left a gift. The scent mixes with roasted boar and lilac perfume. You try not to gag. You nod. You bow. You pretend it's all perfectly normal. Because to criticize Versailles was to risk offense. Even worse, to seem unsophisticated. A fringe detail for your collection. In one diplomatic disaster, a Dutch envoy declined a second invitation after his boots were splashed by wastewater while walking beneath a balcony. His withdrawal caused a minor scandal, one that was resolved by gifting him a porcelain chamber pot shaped like a tulip, subtle. And yet many visitors did return, because Versailles wasn't just a place, it was a political orbit. To be close to the king meant influence, access, power, even if it also meant fleas, stomach cramps, and eau de compost. There were efforts occasionally to improve things for guests. Some apartments were hastily scrubbed before important meetings. Scented fires were lit. In one case, rose petals were literally glued to the walls of a visiting dignitary's chamber. By morning, they had wilted into something resembling a fermented floral sauce. You reach a window now and glance out. The gardens gleam in the distance, deceptively pristine. But you know better. Somewhere out there, a footman is dumping a slop bucket behind a hedge. A guest is stepping carefully between gravel stones, breathing shallowly, smiling politely, because Versailles, for all its grandeur, was not what it seemed. It was a glittering stage, and the audience was forced to smell their way through the performance. You turn from the reception room and wander down a quieter passage. The noise fades, the perfumes thin, the candles flicker dimmer here. It feels less like a palace now, and more like a sick room, one that's long since been emptied, but still remembers. Because beyond the filth and fanfare, Versailles had another silent resident disease, and it didn't matter how high your title or how gold your trim illness found you. You step into a smaller chamber, once used by a minor prince who died. Historians think of fever of unknown origin. That's 18th century code for we have no idea what happened, but it wasn't pretty. The walls still hold a certain humidity. You imagine the smell wasn't flowers. Versailles was a hotbed of contagion. Dysentery, smallpox, influenza, typhoid, and always the mysterious court fevers. Illness didn't whisper here, it howled. With no proper sewage system, open windows, and thousands of bodies packed into often airless rooms, the palace was a petri dish dressed in satin. And the causes were everywhere. Rats in the kitchen, mold in the tapestries, and most dangerously human waste soaking into the stone. One scholar wrote that Versailles suffered from a slow rot that no one wished to name. You run a hand along the edge of a carved mantle. It's smooth, cold, but somewhere inside the wall, probably damp. Mold bloomed behind tapestries, in crawl spaces, under stairs. Invisible spores drifting into air that was already thick with perfume and people's breath. You think of the Queen Marie Antoinette during one of her illnesses, tucked into a feather bed beside a pile of roses intended to refresh the air. The physician took her pulse, while a chambermaid discreetly removed a soiled cloth from under the bed. Perfume was sprayed, curtains drawn. Illness made invisible until it wasn't. Historians still argue whether disease spread more quickly because of Versailles' design or simply the sheer density of people. But most agree the palace was a trap for air. Long halls, sealed windows, no ventilation. Fireplaces smoked. Soot clung to lungs. Respiratory problems were common. Chronic coughing was so normal it had a nickname, le tout noble, the noble cough. A fringe detail for your late-night reflections. The court believed that bad smells caused disease. This miasma theory led them to cover up odors, not eliminate the sources. So instead of removing waste, they mastered. Instead of drying damp rooms, they burned incense. Instead of fresh air, they sealed the windows and sprayed orange blossom onto wet walls. You find an old door, slightly ajar, revealing a tiny room with faded wallpaper and a broken chair. This was once a sick room, maybe? Or a maid's quarters? It's hard to tell. But the air is different. Still. Pressed down. Like it remembers breath that never fully left. Disease didn't just haunt the lower classes. Royals died young here. Children faded. Nobles coughed themselves hoarse. One duchess is said to have collapsed during a ball mid-curtsy, her perfume bottle shattering beside her. They said it was vapors. Modern scholars suspect tuberculosis. Versailles had no proper infirmary. Ill nobles were treated in their beds. Bleeding, purging leeches, standard protocol. No antiseptic. No understanding of germs. Just guesswork and formality. If someone died, the chamber was scrubbed with vinegar and prayers, then reused. You hear a soft creak, imaginary, but real enough in your head. Maybe it's the floor settling. Maybe it's history shifting slightly under your feet. The palace, for all its splendor, was sick. Not just structurally, systemically, philosophically. A place that prized beauty over health, performance over truth, smell over substance. And you begin to realize the filth of Versailles wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, it was institutional. A monarchy that let its own walls rot while demanding reverence, a nobility that powdered their faces while their lungs filled with damp. A king who waved to courtiers from his golden toilet while fevers killed the servants behind the walls. And still the chandeliers sparkled, the perfumes were sprayed, the gowns twirled across the ballroom floor like nothing was wrong. You step out of the sick room, behind you the door drifts closed on its own. The air in the hall suddenly feels heavier. You walk slowly now, the pace dragging the candles thinning. Versailles has shown you its perfume-soaked armor, its velvet-covered rot, and the ghosts of fevers behind the curtains. But as you follow the winding path deeper into the palace's final days, something else begins to curl at the edges of the narrative anger. Because eventually, the people outside these golden walls stopped wrinkling their noses, they started clenching their fists, and the filth of Versailles wasn't just physical anymore, it became political. You step into a salon, long unused. The chairs are stacked. A chandelier droops slightly to one side. This room once heard laughter chamber music flirtations whispered behind fans. But by the 1780s, the sounds changed. Grumblings, mutterings, silence followed by long glances. The court still powdered its wigs, but even the perfume couldn't cover the scent of fear. The outside world was catching on. France was changing, bread prices were rising, taxes soared, and in Paris people were starting to talk about the smell of Versailles, not with awe, but with disgust. Pamphlets began circulating. Political cartoons showed nobles relieving themselves on peasants from balconies. Satirists wrote about courtiers who smelled of gold and dung. A fringe detail. One poem from 1787 described the palace as a rose whose roots grow in sewage. Harsh, yes, but not inaccurate. Historians still debate whether the smell of Versailles contributed directly to the French Revolution. Of course, there were deeper causes: inequality, financial collapse, Enlightenment ideals. But symbolically, the stench mattered. It became shorthand for decay, decadence, and detachment. You picture a Parisian fishwife in 1788, scrubbing her stall, hearing rumors of the Queen's perfumed hairpieces, and meat-filled feasts, while her own children begged for crusts. Maybe she had once dreamed of Versailles. Now she imagined tearing it down. The palace that had once dazzled diplomats began to embarrass them. Visitors mocked the smell. Foreign papers ridiculed the filth. Even nobles began to murmur about how things have slipped. There's a powerful irony here. The same aristocrats who refused to build proper toilets were now afraid to walk the gardens after dusk, not because of the odor, but because of the rumors, whispers of insurrection, of letters, slipped under doors of servants vanishing without word. The stink became a metaphor. The rot of Versailles, the golden cesspit. Even the Sun King's legacy couldn't shine through it anymore. And then came the people. In October 1789, a mob of women marched on Versailles. They came with hunger in their bellies and mud on their shoes. They wanted bread. They wanted justice. And whether they knew it or not, they brought with them the cleansing power of exposure. They stormed the palace. The guards fought. Blood was spilled. And as the crowd surged into the marble halls, stepping through the same corridors, you've wondered tonight, they weren't just confronting a monarchy. They were confronting a lie. Because Versailles was no longer mysterious. It wasn't sacred. It was filthy, cracked, infested, peeling beneath the paint. These weren't gods, they were humans hiding behind perfume bottles and chamber pots. You picture a revolutionary woman in the queen's bedroom picking up a silver comb, sniffing it and recoiling. And then laughing. Because nothing, not even royal rose water, could disguise the fact that this place stank. Marie Antoinette fled. The court scattered, and Versailles, the grand symbol of divine monarchy, was left behind. Not burned, not destroyed, abandoned, and over time the rooms fell quiet. The tapestries unraveled, the waste dried, the ghosts settled. But the scent, they say, lingered. Some visitors, even today, claim certain corners smell odd, not bad, just persistent, as if the palace still exhaled occasionally, a reminder that no matter how much gold you hang on the walls, you can't perfume away a broken system. You turn back toward the hall. Versailles was not brought down by torches, it was undone by its own refusal to flush. You take one last slow turn through the palace, the candlelight now whispering more than glowing. Versailles doesn't roar anymore, it creaks. The air is still but not empty. There's something held here, something fermented, something proud, something stubborn. The rooms may have emptied centuries ago, but the myth of Versailles never truly left. You find yourself in a quiet antechamber where sunlight barely filters through dusty glass. A guide might call this the ghost wing, not because it's haunted by spirits, though that's debatable, but because it holds memories no one wants to discuss. Like how, after the revolution, Versailles was looted, repurposed even briefly, used as a military barracks. Velvet chairs burned for warmth. Gold trim was pried loose. Tapestries were used as horse blankets. Dignity, much like perfume, evaporated fast. And yet over time Versailles was slowly restored. Not to life, perhaps, but to memory. The walls were repainted, the floors polished, the mirrors dusted. And the smell? Well, you smile. They say the smell is gone. But smell, as any historian or chambermaid will tell you, is the last sense to forget. It clings. It returns. It waits. There are reports, quiet ones from staff, from tourists, from scholars, spending long hours in certain corners of the palace. They mention a sudden wave of scent. Not perfume, not rot, something mixed. Powder and mildew, ambergris and old linen, rose water and waste. You pause near a gilded fireplace. There's nothing visibly wrong. And yet, you know. Somewhere in the fibers of this palace, beneath layers of pain and silence, the truth still breathes. And then come the myths. Visitors say the queen still walks the halls, that she tugs at her corset in frustration, gasping not from fear, but from stench. That Louis XIV's perfume lingers in the morning light, rising up through the floorboards like a final royal sigh. That if you wander the gardens alone at night, you'll step into a warm pocket of air and think, someone has used this spot recently. A fringe rumor claims that one of the palace's perfume formulas, long forgotten, long forbidden, was rediscovered and bottled again. The result? An instant headache, and a memory of something that shouldn't be remembered. Historians still debate what really lingers at Versailles. Is it scent? Is it guilt? Is it a warning? Because the story of Versailles is not just about wealth. It's about ignoring reality. It's about masking dysfunction with powder. About building a mirror so beautiful no one notices the filth behind the curtain. You make your way toward the front doors now. The halls feel a little colder. The chandeliers a little duller. You pass through the marble vestibule where thousands of feet once marched, where perfumes once mixed mid-air like battle cries, where the smell of ambition often overpowered the stench of sweat for a moment. And then came the silence. As you reach the grand doors, you inhale one last time. The air smells clean, but part of you doesn't believe it. So here we are at the end of the hall, at the edge of the gardens, with only echoes and dust in our pockets. You've wandered through velvet rot and perfume deception, seen the lace masks fall away from a palace that refused to see itself clearly. Versailles was more than a marvel. It was a lesson, a golden dream slowly fermented into a cautionary tale. Now I want you to let the images fade. Gilded chairs dissolve into shadow. Powdered wigs crumble into mist. The heavy doors close behind you, not with a bang, but a whisper. Breathe in, slowly. There's no rosewater here, no vinegar, no thick cloud of ambergris. Just the quiet hum of your room, the soft rhythm of night. Let your shoulders ease down. The corridors of Versailles are behind you. The marble is cold. The mirrors are still. And the smells, well, they've stopped following you. At least for now, let the past sink back into its walls. The flickering candle has gone out, and all that's left is calm.